So he said, no, I want to give it every chance, do what you can. So we fixed the bird and did the surgery and sort of 3 or 4 weeks later, sort of did our post-operative check. And he drove this bird 9 hours. This bird came 9 hours overnight from the moors where they were flying in Scotland down to us overnight. And so we treated it and came back 3 or 4 weeks later, took some x-rays. I was like, oh, that doesn't actually look too bad. Fine, it might do a little bit better than I thought. And then I didn't hear from the client for about 6 months. And 6 months later, he sent me this picture of it flying back up in Scotland. Couldn't really tell that it ever had the injury, and I was like, wow. And isn't it, it's not so much what we did, but just birds' ability to heal was incredible.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Welcome back for another episode of the Falconry Told podcast, and what is now our 6th episode in our series featuring falconers in the UK. And of course, I have to give a quick shout out and thank you to the 2 guys that made this series possible, being Simon Tyers, who is also the author of The Specialist Falcon. And The Specialist Falcon is a book that is basically an overview of Simon's personal approach to lowland game hawking in the UK. Even though this book is written more from a British perspective, it's also a great book with lots of information on flying long wings, especially involving newer technology like drones and such. And I highly recommend it if you want to pick up a book that has a lot of information about the approach to flying long wings. So if you haven't picked up your copy, I recommend that you head to thespecialistfalcon.com, and there's also signed copies available on there as well. So you'll definitely want to add this one to your library if you haven't already. And of course, I have to give a quick shout out to Neil Davies, who is the editor of Pursuit Falconry and Conservation magazine, which, if you haven't checked it out yet, is another great publication that is doing a great job in promoting the art of falconry across the world. There's always lots of great new content, art, equipment, etc. in every issue. So if you haven't yet, head to pursuitfalconry.co.uk and subscribe now. And I believe it was on the second morning or so of the Valley Expo, I got a chance to nab Tom Dutton for a bit before things got too busy and pick his brain some about some of the diseases that affect us greatly in falconry, and of course get some of the stories from him that he found most impactful in his career so far. Tom's a falconer and veterinarian in the UK, so a lot of his knowledge that he was willing to share in this episode I think you'll find fairly useful, or at least somewhat insightful. So all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to the conversation I had with Tom Dutton. Here we go. How you doing this morning, Tom? You doing all right?
Yeah, doing really well, thank you. Really well.
Sweet. How was yesterday for you? Did you get tired of talking at all?
No, I enjoyed yesterday. It was really good to have sort of new faces and old faces. So a few sort of existing clients, met up with some really good friends as well, and then some new people. So it was a really good day. Good weather, didn't rain, so can't complain. Bit of wind today though.
Yeah, it's looking not so promising today outside. Pretty gray, pretty windy. Yeah, I'm not really sure weather-wise is going to be the best day today, but I guess we'll see what happens.
Absolutely. The birds, they're flying a few birds at the moment, so we'll see how they cope in these conditions. It's early season, so I think the birds that aren't quite fit yet might struggle a little bit on the demonstrations, but it'll be good experience for them.
Yeah, we were just talking. Normally I hate a lot of background noise and stuff, but honestly I really haven't minded the occasional dog bark or engine noise from the row crows and things like that. It kind of just adds to the the ambiance of the situation, I guess.
Absolutely, I think the row crows are a nice noise. I think some of those drones, the whine of those drones as they come over is a little bit more tedious sometimes, but they're amazing technology.
Yeah, no, there's been some cool stuff here. I've kind of been intrigued by some of the stuff. I was talking to Kevin some last night a lot about the row crow and the potential for that. You know, some stuff like that really hasn't caught on too much in the States yet. It's more just typical droning and things like that. But I was telling him last night I could see some practical applications for it. But I mean, have you ever messed with any of this stuff?
Yeah, so I've had the row crows probably since the first year they came out. I think the row bara was the first, and for the birds that I was flying, it was just a bit big. And for the land near my house, it was just a not as mobile, didn't really suit as well. But when the Rocro came out the first year, I think I probably ordered one of the first models, crashed it spectacularly, repaired it a few times, got it going, and really enjoyed it. I think the biggest use for me is raptor rehabilitation. I think for our wild injured birds that come into the hospital, particularly with orthopedic injuries that we repair, being able to use something like a Rocro and getting that reliable, high quality flight training leading up to a release is definitely going to improve the rehab. I think that's one of our biggest responsibilities when we're treating these birds, is that it's not just fixing the fracture, it's getting these birds rehabilitated and actually having a good chance of survival in the wild again. So we've been doing that and really seen some positive initial results compared to traditional lure flying or drone flying.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually really, I didn't even think about that. I mean, I could see even a use for, educational shows, things like that, or exhibitions, but I didn't even think about the application for rehab.
Yeah.
Getting bird strength back up and working, getting their muscle, worked back up and strength overall. And no, that's actually really, really cool. I mean, yeah. Do you use that semi-frequently for that then? I mean,
yeah, I think the problem with it is we rely very heavily on falconers to do a lot of our rehab, and most falconers only have a finite amount of time. They might have their own birds they've got to fly, and if they take on the responsibility of a wild rehab bird, that's a big time commitment for them. So there's probably only 3 or 4 birds in any given time who have been trained in that way. But this is the time of year it happens. We see it. This is where we see the peak of our raptor casualties with freshly fledged birds getting themselves into trouble. So for the next sort of three to 4 months, this is when we'll probably start seeing a few more cases and start finding willing falconers to rehab these birds. And I think the falconers enjoy doing it. I think it's good for them. It's something they can give back to conservation. I think everyone doesn't really appreciate how conservationally minded the majority of falconers are, and they want to see wild raptors doing really well. They're the biggest advocate for wild raptors that I know, and it's certainly a really positive thing that they get involved with. And we've found that because the speed that these birds then regain fitness with the Rocro training, they may only need to remain in captivity sort of post recovery for maybe 4 to 6 weeks, and they're gaining enough fitness in that short window that they can get released. And so we're getting these birds released before the winter months, the harder months, which is really important.
For sure, yeah. Because if you released them in the winter months like that, then they'd almost definitely probably die for sure. But as far as the turnaround time, what would normally be the turnaround time for a lot of your cases? I mean, if you weren't using it, then would it be more like 2 months or?
Yeah, it could, or longer, maybe even 3 or 4. Mm-hmm. And it's just not, when you say if you're flying to a lure and they're doing that sort of yo-yoing pattern of flight that a lot of birds will do to a lure, it's not a natural hunting style. It doesn't get them picking up a sight picture of natural quarry. It doesn't make a lot of sense. They get to a certain level of fitness and then it sort of plateaus. It's certainly better than putting them in an aviary or hack pen and hoping they're going to gain fitness that way. And sort of 15 years ago, when I sort of looked at raptor rehabilitation, and these birds they'd fix the fracture, they'd go into a big aviary, they would fly short laps at best, build minimal fitness, and then we expected them to survive in the wild. I think we were looking at that with rose tinted spectacles, that many of those birds were going to do well. And I think that these modern techniques, definitely improves their fitness levels infinitely. And you look at the muscle mass that these birds are getting and the condition that they're getting, and the fact they're also learning to climb. You can teach them to learn to climb, use the wind, use the conditions, all those, because the majority of sort of traumatic casualties happen in newly fledged birds, and they've lost a lot of that maternal or paternal training that naturally happens between raptors, which a lot of people don't really understand how much they do learn in a lot of situations from their parents, and so we've got to help them with that to give them a good chance. I think fledged wild raptors have a sort of, depending on the species and in the part of the country, anything from a 30 to a 50% survival rate for the first year. So I think if we're going to release a wild injured bird, it's got to have a 30 to 50% chance of surviving. Otherwise, it's not fair. It's not ethical.
There's a lot to be said for nature's beauty and simultaneous cruelty in a lot of ways. And I think that there's a lot of good rehab programs that are out there, and especially in the U.S. There's quite a few really good rehab places. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of those things where, yeah, you want to give the bird the best chance and stuff. I never really thought about droning or, using things like the RoCro and stuff for that, though. I mean, that's really cool. I mean, it's pretty ingenuitive, really, but it's totally another application I would have never thought of. But just real quick, go ahead and give people kind of a rundown of your background.
Absolutely. So I guess if you go right back, always had a fascination with birds, birds of prey, raptors, was around falconry in one way or another, probably from about the age of 14, 15. I think my first Harris hawk, which I flew, would have been about the age of 18, and then flew a lot of accipiters, so a lot of goshawks, sparrowhawks, sort of through my 20s. Went to veterinary school at 18. In the UK, if you're US listeners, it's a postgraduate qualification, but in the UK, it's an undergraduate qualification, so we can do veterinary medicine from 18. So graduated in 2023. As a 23-year-old in 2011, and then went to specialize in avian medicine. So pretty quickly went down that route of specialization, and was fortunate enough to get on a very well-regarded residency training program with a Dr. Neil Forbes, who's world renowned for his innovation in avian medicine, and he also had a big interest in falconry. His grandfather was sort of an early British Falconers Club member, and he had that background as well. So I had sort of 6 fantastic years learning with him, and was fortunate enough to stay on at that hospital subsequently. So I've been at the same specialist referral hospital for 10 years now, and have roughly a 60% avian caseload, and a significant proportion of that are birds of prey. So really varied. And then from a falconry point of view, unfortunately, as the veterinary work that I do is busier and busier and busier, and working long hours doing veterinary medicine, unfortunately the hours to fly birds of prey is much reduced. So I haven't flown a bird personally for 3 seasons now. I think with COVID our workload went up, and obviously staff availability with people getting ill wasn't great. So it's been a tricky, busy 3-year period, but looking forward to you'll never get away from the fact. I think once you've done it, it's sort of in your blood, isn't it? And flying birds of prey, and I'm very keen to fly something again in the near future. But for me, some of this technology we're talking about, these sort of RoCros and drones, it allowed me to fly birds in shorter time frames. So particularly before work, my window for falconry was usually between sort of 6 and 8 a.m. at dawn. You could fly a bird to a row-crow and get it fit and have good flights in a short contained space of time. So although the falconry is incredibly time consuming, you're never going to say you can make it a hobby that fits around work. I think everything else fits around falconry, but it makes some of this technology does make life easier.
Sure. Well, and I mean, from your standpoint too, kind of being torn between multiple worlds like I am, I can totally relate. I mean, we were just talking a little bit ago about some of the healthcare stuff, but no, I mean, yeah, whenever you're constantly being pulled in different directions, it can be a lot harder to fit these other things in. But at least, in your case, it may not be falconry in its purest form per se, but if you're helping out like with rehabbing birds or whatever, and you just got to scratch the itch a little bit, I mean, yeah, there is the possibility of at least being able to work out a bird or something with RoCro or whatever before. I mean, that's cool. At least you get to do something,
Absolutely. If I take the responsibility of doing a rehab peregrine or something, then I know it's a 6-week commitment, but often that's going to be in the summer when I've got better daylight, and can fit that around work a little bit easier. And then I don't have the commitment of having to fly a bird through the winter when I'm not home during the daylight hours. So I think that's where where I can, exactly scratch an itch and still have that close involvement in the falconry community without with overstretching myself. And I think it's really important anyone who commits to getting into falconry has the time to do it, because if you don't have the time, you're just not going to do justice by that bird. And
sure.
If that's what I'm preaching to my clients, they've got to put that time commitment. I've got to make sure I'm doing the same. So I think the rehab work is a really nice sort of crossover between the two communities. And I think I'm really a big advocate for falconers to be involved in rehab and conservation. I think there's always sort of confrontation between falconry and the sporting side of that community with conservation and some other organisations, and I think if they all learnt to work together, it would actually be for the benefit of wild birds. And so that's one of the messages I try and preach as much as possible.
Yeah, I found that a lot of that is, I mean, you're going to have a little bit of that everywhere, no matter what type of thing you're doing, community that you're in. But I mean, there's a lot of places that I know that, I mean, including, I feel like even our area, like where I'm at, I mean, I think we have a pretty decent relationship with our local rehab facility. And well, for that matter, I mean, the Harris Hawk that I just flew this past season, I mean, got the rehab center got a call on her whenever I lost her for a week or two. And, if it wasn't for them picking her up, I mean, I would have, probably lost that bird and stuff too. So, I mean, working hand in hand, I do agree. I mean, if you've got a good relationship and there's not any friction, I mean, it goes without saying, anytime that people can work together in any shape or form, you usually get a better outcome.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I'm a little curious myself with, I mean, anytime I ever encounter people from different countries, I'm always interested to learn more and more about how the differences are with their education system and everything else. I mean, you touched very briefly on the difference between what it takes to be, a vet here as opposed to the U.S. I mean, can you go just a little bit more in depth into that process of how long all that takes and what kind of goes into it here as opposed to other countries?
Yeah, I can probably do quite a decent comparison with the US because I spent a bit of time at Colorado State University in my final year of education and thoroughly enjoyed my time in Fort Collins. In the UK, most veterinary students will do it as an undergrad degree, so you can go straight from your schooling at 18 straight into veterinary medicine qualification. It's a 5-year degree, and at 5 years you're qualified. As long as you pass all your nasty examinations, you're qualified as a veterinary surgeon, and then from there you can go on and specialize, much like a doctor, a human physician will specialize, do some internship program, do a residency or a registrar program, as we call it in the UK, and it takes another sort of 4 to 5 years to specialize yet further. So you could basically spend 10 years in education, for fairly formal education, to become a specialist. A lot of incredibly good vets stay at a GP. They don't choose to specialize. They try and they do more of a GP type work, and that's an incredibly important part of the veterinary medicine as well. In the US, the main difference is you can't do a veterinary medicine degree as an undergraduate degree. So they do an undergrad, which I believe is 3 years. So they're already at least 21 by the time they go into veterinary medicine, maybe a little bit more mature. At 21, I think there's a lot of development that goes on in a lot of people between 18 and 21.
Quite a bit, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that is potentially, you could say, one benefit. I think I was a much better student in the last 2 years of vet school than I was in the first 2 years. I think you do learn a little bit more about yourself as far as education. But so they do an undergrad and then they go into veterinary medicine as a postgrad. Their veterinary medicine degree in the US is only going to be 4 years, but it is a postgraduate degree. So that first year is of sort of undergrad vet med in the UK that they don't do in the US, but they've already done a 3-year degree before. So it takes 7 years in comparison to 5 years in the UK in total. And then the route to specialty is much the same. Usually you do an internship or some type of year somewhere, and then 3 years in a residency program. Quite a lot of my colleagues who graduated in the UK went to the US for their residency programs, and we've had a number of students from the US actually come and do training programs in the UK. So there's quite a bit of bilateral movement across the pond. And quite a lot of UK veterinary schools now are AVMA, so what's that? The American Vet Med Association, I think, accredited. So you can do your veterinary degree as an American or as an international student in the UK, and then be able to practice in the US. So I actually sat my US exam, so I could have practiced in the US had I wanted to, just to keep those options open to me. And every now and then you sort of get this thought, it might be nice to see some new areas and come across and practice over in the States. But yeah, so I think that's really nice. I had a lot of colleagues, American vets, who studied with me at Edinburgh, because Edinburgh is one of the schools that does have an American Vet Med Association accreditation. So I think maybe about 20%, 30% of my year was American students. Some of those have stayed in the UK. A lot of them have gone back, and I'm still in touch with quite a few. And then from my time at Colorado State, I'm still in touch with a lot of veterinarians who I met in that period as well, who are mostly practicing in the States. So it's nice to see both sides. And I'm over in Denver next month at a conference. Yeah, it's different, but I'd hate to say, just like falconry, I'd hate to say one's better than the other. It's a different way of doing it. I think both sides have excellent veterinary qualifications, very good schools. I think, yeah, the path to sort of specialist medicine, the sort of residency programs, you can specialize in anything. So you can specialize in orthopedics, you can specialize in oncology, you can specialize in exotics or avian medicine, or however you'd like to do that. And so there's all the options you would have as a human physician. You have similar options in veterinary medicine.
I was surprised a little bit about some of that too, because so me and my wife's also a respiratory therapist. So,
okay.
Yeah, we kind of inbred a little bit there. But anyway, we were griping one night just about, work and stuff. And she mentioned, she's like, yeah, one of the girls I work with, we were just talking about going back and being horse chiropractors. And I was just like, where did that come from? I was like, what? So she mentioned that, and I think she was only half joking, but at the same time, I was just like, okay, I wonder, just out of curiosity, what it takes. And I was kind of surprised to see that stuff like you still actually have to have a veterinary degree and, be a vet, and to do a lot of those subspecialties. But, yeah, I mean, I can only imagine just almost going into this weird niche, kind of thing. Is it like if you're going to really specialize in a lot of that stuff, though, I'm sure you probably still have to take on a lot of just general, types of clientele and cases, though, right? To really make a substantial living. Or
it depends, actually. I think less and less. So I think in the UK and the US, there are dedicated specialist hospitals where you will get people doing 100% oncology or 100% internal medicine or 100% diagnostic imaging, ultrasounds and CT scans. And yeah, it has become a much more specialized market. Exotics is a little bit, you do have to do some more general cases. So I can't just do birds, but there are clinics in the US. There's one of my colleagues, Brian Spear, in California, and he is 100% birds. He only treats birds and has an incredibly busy hospital. So you've got to have the population.
Well, and that's what I was wondering too, is if, you could get away with that more certainly in bigger population areas and in bigger cities, I'm sure, than, say a small rural town in southern Indiana or something like
Absolutely.
that.
I think if you were going to go in rural Wyoming or Montana, somewhere in the world, I would love to live. I don't think you'd have that market. You'd have to do some general medicine as well.
Sure.
But I get to do 100% exotics, which is perfect for me. I'll see some exotic mammals and some zoo species as well, and see a few reptiles. And so I get that variety. I think it's variety, which is what attracts me to the specialty. I'm able to be a surgeon as well as an imager, as well as a medic still. So I have some general practice, but my general practice is in different species to the average domestic dog or cat. So it's but you can really specialize now, and the clients want it as well, and they're going, if they've got a pet or a working animal, if be it a horse or a bird of prey, and they want to get it treated, they want to see someone who's got the expertise, they expect it, and they're prepared to pay for that service, and so if the general practitioner sort of gets to the limit of their knowledge, then they have that option to refer on. And just in the same way as if I had a knee injury and I went to see my general practitioner and they said, yep, you've maybe done your ligaments, I wouldn't want him to be doing my knee surgery. I want to see an orthopedic surgeon. Sure, that's what your average pet owner now wants, and that's what they're expecting.
Yeah, well, like I said, that's very interesting. I really wish, honestly, that there were a lot more readily available specialists around all parts of the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is definitely quite a bit bigger than, say, your England or whatever. I mean, it goes without saying, but I wish that there was a lot more avian specialists in particular readily available in a larger part of our country. I think that there's definitely kind of a need for that and type of thing. And same thing with herp specialists and things like that. I mean, I think that we don't have near enough of those. So, I mean, I can see that being definitely more lucrative in some areas as opposed to others, but,
It's difficult. There's some really big clinics now in the US. I think it's Arizona Exotics is got 4 or 5 clinics, pure exotic veterinary medicine, but affluent, big metropolitan parts of the US where there's a big population to provide the clients. And it is difficult, where I think traditionally you're going to have probably more falconers in your more rural areas because they've got the land to fly on and the access. But then you're not going to get probably the vets in those rural areas. And whilst my clientele come from anywhere, if you know the United Kingdom, anywhere from London down to the south coast, across to Bristol, up to Birmingham, which in the UK is a big area, but actually that's only really a 2.5 hour radius. Whereas if you're in Fort Collins, Colorado, 2.5 hour radius won't even get you out the state. Exactly. So it's very different from that point of view. And I know when I was practicing there and was not practicing, I was studying in Colorado, there was people coming across state, and I know some of the specialist avian vets in the States are flying across state to treat birds at different places where there just isn't that specialist service local, and the clients want to get that care. There's a lot of traveling involved, which when you've got a sick bird is not always ideal, because they need treatment then and they need treatment immediately.
Exactly. Yeah.
And ideally not have that stress of a drive or a flight even.
For sure. And like I said, I wish it doesn't matter what kind of care, whether it's for animals, people. I mean, we're only, I think, going to keep getting more and more of a shortage over the years. It's going to be a lot harder to convince people each passing year, I think, unfortunately, to get into these fields. I mean, I think it'd probably be a lot easier from the animal side than the people side, but but I don't.
It's difficult. There's a demand as far as there's lots of vets who want to specialize in exotic animals, which is good. There's a lot of people who want to do it. I think there's a lack of training programs, and in the UK there is only one residency training program in avian medicine and surgery, which is the one we do at our hospital and the one I teach on. So we're only taking one person every 18 months. So it's going to build very slowly, the numbers of people. In the US, I'm not sure how many training programs there are in avian and exotic medicine. I would hazard a guess at maybe 10 or 15. But when you've got 330 million, we were saying, as a population over that vast area, that's not going to produce that many people either. It's going to take a long time for that to build up. But compared to 30 years ago, when there was only 1 or 2, it's come a long way. Avian medicine's come a long way in the last 30 years.
Yeah, and then you've got to have people, like you said, like people like yourself that are willing to teach and want to teach. And, I mean, that's another thing that's going to contribute to shortages and stuff too. And then, you have to worry about the sometimes the quality of what people know coming out of some of these programs and stuff too. There's all kinds of considerations, but yeah, I'm happy that people like yourself are willing to take on the challenge of training these newer generations of people, and I hope that more and more keep coming in. But in regards to your falconry in particular, I know you kind of briefly touched on the age frame that you kind of got your first bird and stuff. I mean, don't necessarily have to go into a lot of the hunting experience per se, but I mean, just talk about some of the first birds with a little bit more detail that you had, and kind of the things that you learned initially.
Yeah, so I think our access to falconry in the UK is very different to the US. I'm sure you've covered that maybe in the past, but we don't have a formal mentorship or sponsorship type program in the same way. So a lot of that is done informally, and luckily I've had some really good mentors who have certainly helped me massively with my falconry and taught me an awful lot. So it's first Harris Hawk taught me a lot about understanding behavior, understanding the reason why a bird's acting in a certain way, and how you can adjust what you're doing to correct that with positive reinforcement, the way you're presenting the food, the way you're handling a bird. Just some of the very basic safety stuff is just the way you hold it, the safety position on the glove, all that sort of that it really vitally important teaching is you just trusting your mentor that you're getting that right. And I was lucky, and fortunately with my work I just come in contact with so many well-regarded falconers on such a regular basis. I'm always picking things up from falconers with how they do things, new techniques, and just trying to learn all the time, just trying to be a sponge and absorb from all these people who are practicing excellent falconry to see how they do things and how they train their birds, because there is so much variety. There is not one way to do things, and I think that's where I've been very fortunate, because I just speak to so many different people. Like, you come to an event like this where you speak to 300-400 people about their falconry experiences, you can learn so much. So I was very fortunate, to have a lot of fun and success with sort of my early birds. And I think, but going from a Harris Hawk to flying at something like a Goshawk, it was a real challenging transition. I think Harris Hawks teach you a lot of bad habits. You can get away with things with Harris Hawks that you can't certainly get away with Goshawks. And when you suddenly realise you've got a sort of a frustrated Goshawk, that can get a bit fruity. So I think this is where technology can really help. So sort of drag lures, pull lures, sort of the Bull-X machines that Danny Carter is demonstrating here is just such a nice way to get simulated hunting experience for a raptor that is it's enrichment. All these things are enrichment and can just make a huge difference to a bird's mental well-being if you can get these guaranteed quality simulated hunting flights, which are less weather dependent and everything else to build fitness. I think so that's I learned a lot about that with Goshawks, that their mentality, what they're happy doing, how you have to enrich them is very different from a Harris Hawk. Their memories maybe not quite as good. They need their positive reinforcement lessons need repeating more times for them to know what you're doing, and you've just got to handle them differently. Then moved on to flying some small things, so sort of Merlin and Sparrowhawks, where very high metabolic rates, different management from as far as diet, to how often you feed them. You might be flying them twice a day and feeding twice a day rather than once a day. Completely different experience again. So I've been very fortunate with, I guess, the variety of birds I've flown and been taught different lessons by each bird, and I think I've enjoyed every species. I think at the moment, I think probably my favorite bird to fly has probably been the merlin. I think from a personality point of view, they have a lovely little personality. And whilst I think the relationship you have with a bird of prey is probably slightly different to the relationship you have with your pet dog, I would say there's a curiosity and sort of inquisitiveness of a merlin's personality, which was kind of endearing. So I thought they were fantastic little birds, and really interesting, and certainly taught you how to swing a lure well. Sort of some lazy lure swinging that you could sort of get away with a geosaker. You could not get away with a merlin, with a so agile and little pocket rockets. That was fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it's always fun getting other people's interpretations of certain species, because I don't know, I've talked about this a few different times before, but I mean, the first birds I saw being flown in falconry were goshawks myself. And so, you know, I kind of got overly desensitized to just that, I don't know, stigma that seems to surround goshawks, for example, to the point now where I'm like, I thought about flying one a couple seasons ago, but then like the need for a new septic system kind of changed my plans. But yeah, no, I mean, overall though, like, I think you're either an accipiter guy kind of, or you're not. And sometimes you're just a long winger or you're not. I mean, there are a lot of guys too that I've talked to that kind of like it all, but they still have that little bit of personal preference over everything. I mean, I'm still a fan mostly of kestrels personally.
Wonderful.
I like tiny long wings as well. But yeah, I mean, it's all about personality. I've always found that you can kind of, once you judge a person's personality, you can almost instantly tell which kind of bird they're going to prefer to fly. It's kind of weird. I don't know. Has it kind of been the same for you, that you've noticed that?
I think to some respects, I think the biggest thing here is, yes, it's personality and what you're going to work well with. I see that a lot with dogs as well. I've found very much with dogs that I seem to work better with bitches than dogs now. I have a really lovely male English setter, but I've found my wife's bitches far easier to work with. It's just, I think that's a personality thing with me for whatever reason. I
mean, assuming you've got the prey for whatever, of course.
And this is the big thing. It's the country. It's trying to fly the wrong species in the wrong environment. If you've got a load of woodland and marginal areas and you try and fly a big long wing in it, you're going to get frustrated. If you've got really open country with miles of views, with no wind turbines, no electric pylons, it'd be such a shame not to fly a long wing on it. And I think this is the big thing, is it's what you like, but it's also what country you've got to fly. And obviously you can adapt. You can use things like row crows to fly a long wing in a closed space. What we got here, we got an arena that's maybe a few hundred meters squared, and you can get a bird fit and stimulated and enriched flying in such a small space. Fantastic, but it's not really where they're developed. They've evolved to fly. Although some of the falcon species are remarkably widespread now in the UK, sort of from very urban environments and all the margins and all the way to the open moorland. It's amazing how well some of the wild falcons are doing. So, but yeah, I think that's the big thing is, yeah, you've got to have a species that you enjoy, because otherwise what's the point? And I hate this thing of that you hear a sort of starter bird, first bird. I'm going to start with this. I think just start with the right bird, whatever bird you like. And yes, some birds are easier than others, but there's no point in thinking of a bird as a 2-year project, as a stepping stone to something else, because that bird you've bought lives 15, 20 years. So you've got to be expecting to provide for that for that period of time, or at least have a plan for that bird. Otherwise you're not doing good by that first bird, and you'd be better off getting the species you originally wanted in the first place. So as long as you've got good mentors that can help you and has experience with that species.
Well, and I think that's very key too. What you just said is that, I mean, there's a lot of people that have a lot of varying opinions on what types of birds people should start with. I mean, as you know, predominantly in the U.S., most people start with red tails, and for good reason. But like, even some people, even like with the second bird, still prefer people not to do, like, say, American kestrels and things like that. And this is one of those very opinionated topics in a way. But I mean, I touch on this some with people, but like, as far as, I'm kind of a mindset that if you have a mentor that's very experienced with a certain species of bird, I don't think it's necessarily a wrong thing for someone to learn on a certain species if they have very good guidance and mentorship. I mean, there's guys that I know that live out west in the U.S. that still haven't ever flown a red tail. They learned on, like a peregrine, for example, if their state lets them, have that as a first bird or whatever. But their mentor was like new longwings. So I mean, in those kind of scenarios, I think that's okay. I mean, you don't want someone that is not experienced with a certain species trying to teach that. I mean, that kind of defeats the purpose too.
Absolutely. I think that's completely right. And yeah, having, if you've got the right mentor who's going to spend time, and I think it's very hard to be mentored remotely. I think that's one of the biggest things is finding a mentor you can physically spend time with the bird and that mentor together in the same place, because that mentor is not going to be able to advise correctly if they're not seeing the behavior and the response of that bird. You can't describe it, and there's the subtleties between being unfit versus unresponsive versus low in energy are quite overlapping some of the signs that bird's going to show, and that's where the experience comes in. And I think that's where having a mentor actually seeing you fly the bird is so important. And I think the internet has made people sort of in a position where they can garner a lot of information without having to meet people. But I still think that face-to-face mentorship is incredibly important.
For sure. No, I 100% agree. But well, let's shift back real quick. I'm kind of more towards let's shift back more towards the vet side of things, because I'm kind of curious to see what kind of differences, if any, there are between the types of volumes of things that you see as main issues with raptors in particular here as opposed to the U.S., or if it's very similar. I mean, first of all, I guess we can go ahead and talk a little bit about the whole avian influenza issue and kind of what's the deal with it? Why has it been so bad the last couple years, you think? And
with avian influenza is a concerning topic to anyone who's keeping birds, whether they're keeping farm chickens or whether they're keeping pet birds or whether they're keeping falconry birds. It's been a bad year in continental Europe and the United Kingdom with avian influenza. Like any flu virus, avian influenza is capable of mutating, and it does regularly mutate. Every time that virus replicates, there's a chance of it changing somewhat, and sometimes those changes will give it a favorable change in the way that virus acts or interacts with the environment, which makes it either more infectious or survive longer in the environment or whatever it is. So we've currently got a virus which is very infectious that has a very long environmental persistence. So it's shed in feces or respiratory secretion. So after that liquid leaves a bird, it is infectious in the environment for a set time. That time is increased with this particular strain of virus that we're seeing. So the chance that virus then comes in contact with another host animal, another bird, is much higher, and therefore it just is the whole outbreak is continuing for a much longer time than normal. So avian influenza in the UK used to be a very seasonal thing. We have a migration of birds that come across in the autumn period, in the fall, sort of September, October. They interact with our wild birds. They bring avian influenza with them. And then bridging species or other species can become infected, and captive birds can potentially be infected. But as soon as the weather warmed up in the spring, the environment was less favorable for the virus to survive. The virus had shorter persistence in the environment with high temperature and dry weather, and so the virus would gently drift off, and we'd stop seeing cases usually by March, sometimes into April. This year we had a case, our most recent case was 2 days ago in Devon. So we're still seeing cases in captive birds in July, and huge numbers of cases still in wild birds. So this virus it survived the weather change. We've had an incredibly hot period of weather in the last few weeks, and the virus is still transmitting through wild birds at this point. So it's a bit unprecedented as far as avian influenza in the UK. And it has massive implications from the risk to your birds if you're flying birds and they're going to come into contact with wild birds. The risk of transmission of virus is going to be there. Inadvertent transmission in the food is there. The risk that just wild birds come into where you're weathering and keeping your birds and transmit virus to your birds is there. So falconers are having to practice very stringent biosecurity to keep their birds safe. And then for people who have business with falconry, and that may be breeding birds and exporting to other countries overseas, it has implications there as far as testing that needs to be done pre-export, health inspections that need to be done, or in the past we've had complete bans on exports to certain countries, which financially and economically is really not good.
Devastating.
And it's the same with, obviously from a government level, they're very concerned about being able to export food produce, so poultry, and the effect that the avian influenza outbreak will have on that. And then from sort of a more local level, we're obviously very concerned about our clients and their ability to keep business and obviously keep their birds healthy. It's really affected what we can do as well. So I was talking all about that wild rehab stuff that we do, and it's really important to me, and maintaining a sort of a service to wild birds and rescue centres and charities. We have to be very careful about bringing wild birds into the hospital now, because obviously any wild bird could potentially be carrying avian influenza virus, and whilst it might have a traumatic injury, you don't know if it's carrying virus as well, and particularly when you're talking about species like waterfowl and gulls that can carry virus without looking apparently sick in the early stages. So we have very strict rules about quarantining birds before they can come into the hospital with wild birds. It's affecting our ability to do trauma surgery on wild birds, fracture repairs, these sorts of procedures that we'd normally do sort of pro bono to try and provide a really nice service to some of the charities. We're really restricted on what we can do, because obviously for our clients' birds, we can't risk exposing them to virus in the hospital. So it's really affecting our work as well. Some of the wildlife charities here stopped taking in wild birds because they were seeing cases in the wildlife charities. So it's really challenging. We're moving from a sort of a situation at the moment where we had to sort of try and stamp out avian influenza for the short months where it arrived in the winter, and then for the large parts of the year we didn't have any avian influenza, to a situation where at the moment it's looking like we may even have to learn to live with avian influenza and to change our strategies. At the moment we don't vaccinate in the UK, you can only vaccinate under license, and we don't do that. But it's are we going to have to start thinking about vaccinating captive birds? Are we going to have to think about really improving our biosecurity? When there's been cases of avian influenza this year and they've been investigated, it's sort of, there's been biosecurity breaches, issues with sort of personnel moving between units without it being documented or without changing their boots like they should. All these little things we're having to be so much hotter on, and you really see why biosecurity is important at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, is there anything in particular that, or do you see any higher incidence for the most part of natural, like just kind of natural, a little bit higher immunity with some of these viruses and some of these different, I mean, what makes like certain species of waterfowl and certain, types of birds a little bit more resistant to these strands than, say, your raptors? Is it just lack of exposure? Or?
Yeah, so it might be lack of exposure. The virus has evolved to live within certain species without killing them. So for a virus, you think, how am I going to survive? I'm a virus, how am I going to survive? Well, I want to live in an animal for long enough that I can be transmitted to other animals without killing that animal. So I kill that animal too quickly, I don't have a chance to transfer to another animal. That's sort of the way viruses tend to evolve. And we're seeing it. I hate to go back to COVID, and there's lots of theories with COVID, but you see it with the COVID virus.
You said the C word, not me.
Yeah, I know. But it's and this was predicted it would probably happen this way years ago.
Sure,
that it becomes slightly less dangerous. The severity of the disease seems to be decreasing. And obviously vaccination may be having an effect on that as well, but it's becoming more infectious. So each new mutation that we see, this one transmits slightly easier than the last one, this has got a higher infectious rate. Every new mutation then is naturally more infectious, slightly less mortality.
Yeah, right.
And that's the way a lot of viruses will evolve. So a lot of these avian influenza viruses have evolved to a fact that they can live within waterfowl. That waterfowl can migrate whilst carrying the virus, so it doesn't kill it quickly. It's still got the strength to migrate a great distance. And then it may succumb to the virus if it becomes immunosuppressed after a migration, or it gets stressed with the breeding season or mixing with other birds, and that creates a physiological stress and then disease susceptibility. But it wants to be able to transmit around the world. So that's why the virus has evolved in certain species to cause mild, moderate disease, still allowing them to migrate and transmit virus. And then it contacts a species that maybe doesn't have that immunity, or it's not its original species that sort of carries it, and then it's dramatic, severe disease. And you'll hear about low pathogenic and high pathogenic virus, and they always talk about high pathogenic avian influenza. Obviously, that's the one that instantly you think, well, it's high pathogenic, it must be more serious. That doesn't necessarily apply to raptors. That only really applies to production poultry. So when they work out whether a virus is low path or high path, it's basically how much mortality will it cause in chickens. It's not to do with how much mortality it will cause in raptors. So a low pathogenic virus in chickens could be high mortality in raptors. And in raptors, it seems to cause, they are one of the more susceptible species, it seems to cause severe encephalitis, so brain issues, and very bad neurological signs. But some avian influenza virus, it can actually be really different. Some of the low pathogenic avian influenza virus, when it's in poultry or it's in waterfowl, it's actually quite difficult to tell it apart from other respiratory viruses or even bacterial infections sometimes. So the signs can overlap quite a lot. And a low pathogenic virus only needs a minor mutation to then become high pathogenic potentially. So that's why they're tracking virus all the time. So there's always surveillance. If they pick up more than 3 dead birds in one place, they will test them. They will see if the virus is mutating, how that virus is changing, and is it becoming more dangerous. And obviously one of the big concerns with avian influenza at the moment, there's been very, very few human cases with this strain. There was one case in the UK reported where this person had incredibly close contact with infected wildfowl. Waterfowl. I don't think they were wildfowl. I think they were just pet waterfowl, and contracted a mild influenza virus of the H5N1 virus. But in the past, it has caused quite high mortality H5N1 avian influenza in Asia, in East Asia, where there's bird markets. A lot of people are slaughtering, preparing food in their own homes, and they're obviously getting a big viral exposure. And the big concern is that a host, someone or an animal, will be infected with a human virus, influenza virus, and avian influenza virus at the same time. They will reorganize, mix, and you'll get a bad virus pop out that has the risk of spreading from human to human. And that's not happening at the moment, and the risk to humans at the moment with this avian influenza virus is low. That's the government assessment. It's low risk at the moment, but if it was to mutate, if it was to change, that's why we have to keep a very close eye, and equally why these things are important. So it's not just animal health, it's this whole One Health. Animal health is important with human health as well. Those things overlap and are very intrinsically linked. So that's why they trace avian influenza incredibly carefully.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense, especially like you mentioned with these viruses, and a lot of which are so transmissible between, humans and animals alike. It's hard to really keep tabs on them mutating because it's inevitable in a lot of ways. I mean, a lot of these viruses that are able to be harbored in animals, I mean, you could theoretically, do every precaution in the world for people, but I mean, it's still going to mutate and still change and stuff, and then get retransmitted back again, no matter how good immune system wise people are. There's still a good chance that these viruses are going to be harbored in animals, mutate, and then eventually come back into our population somehow anyway. But a lot of people, I don't think, realize that a lot. So that's kind of I was curious as to the subtle differences maybe in some of these ones that are harbored more in certain species of animals, why they're more susceptible and stuff. But
certain diseases are very specialist, live in certain species, and the chances of them jumping from bird to mammal, because birds, you've got to remember, birds run at a warmer temperature. The average body temperature of a bird, I we do Celsius is like 40 to 41 Celsius. Humans run about 37. So it actually takes quite a specialist virus to be able to live in both hosts, both an avian host and a human host. But certain viruses can do that, and they're the ones we worry about. Those ones that can jump species to species. Some things naturally won't, but some things do have that ability.
Gotcha. Well, and just out of curiosity too, I mean, and just from your point of view, from your practice over the years, what have you seen to be like the biggest issues with raptors? I mean, has it been more lead poisoning? Has it been more, certain viruses? I mean, what exactly do you see is the common biggest issue with raptors?
We have a few, and you've mentioned a couple. So we have traumas. I think if you keep and fly captive raptors, you will get the occasional traumatic incident. That may be hitting a stock fence. That may be...
It happens.
Yeah, these things happen. It's no different to running your pet dog and it's sticking a foot down a rabbit hole and getting a traumatic injury. These things happen. And so you get those. You get fractures, you get wounds. So there's that side of thing. And then as far as infectious disease or sort of bacterial fungal infections, we get aspergillus. We keep a lot of species in the UK which are aspergillus sensitive. So your goshawks, your Falcons. I think one of the other ones is your juvenile red-tailed hawk. They're aspergillus sensitive, and although we don't fly a lot of red tails in the UK compared to the US, I imagine the people flying red tails in the US see aspergillus periodically, but we see a lot of it. We breed a lot of birds for the Middle Eastern market in the UK, so we've got a lot of Falcons, semen donors, and imprints, and we'll deal with aspergillus cases in those. Particularly in this sort of warm, hot, humid weather that we just had, that we've already seen a spike in aspergillus in the last couple of weeks coming into the hospital. And then, we get some viral things. So you get your foodborne viruses. So particularly things like herpes virus, it's particularly transmitted by feeding pigeon. And then you can get other little viruses that get transmitted in bird species, such as adenovirus. So you get these viral diseases as well. And then you get sort of your pododermatitis, bumblefoot cases. So I'd say, it's difficult to put a percentage on it. The nice thing about our practice is because we breed a lot of birds here, you see all the neonatal juvenile problems, and you see the breeding bird problems as well, the reproductive disease or poor reproductive performance that we investigate. And then we have a lot of flying birds as well. So then you start seeing the flying bird trauma issues. So we have very varied caseload. Whereas if you're flying a lot of passage birds or iris birds and wild take birds, you're not seeing as many sort of reproductive and neonatal disease. So it's a real variety. It is a real variety. And you get seasonal things. So sort of last couple of months, I've been dealing with all the repro stuff. And now we'll get a lot of the sort of warm weather aspergillus stuff. And then we'll start getting, as it gets towards the flying seasons, we'll start getting the trauma stuff. Yeah. So we do see seasonal patterns.
Yeah, I mean, just out of curiosity too, I mean, I've seen kind of some issues with this with other friends' birds, and I've had some unfortunate incidents with infections, just out of nowhere killing a bird that I've had and things like that. But particularly in regards to Asper, because it seems to be, like you said, one of the more prevalent issues, especially in your Jeers and your Goshawks and things like that. But is there anything that really differentiates, other than, I mean, you've got usually your respiratory symptoms, with the heavy breathing, the panting and things like that. But I mean, is there anything symptom wise with birds that have Asper that oftentimes can overlap or kind of mislead? I mean, the only surefire way usually to figure out exactly what's going on is to get a necropsy done, like after a bird has died or something, I know. But I mean, what are some of the symptoms that can commonly overlap, like from Asper to, say, your West Nile or some of these other viral issues? I'm just curious, because it seems like that's kind of been an issue with sometimes with either birds getting misdiagnosed sometimes and things like that. So
yeah. Well, we're really lucky we don't have West Nile here yet. Although we have West Nile vectors, and there is West Nile in continental Europe. So at some point we are probably going to see West Nile in the UK. So we're not looking forward to that one. And that's another thing we're monitoring closely. I got West Nile when I was in Colorado, so I understand West Nile. Too much time down by the river with mosquitoes, I think. Yeah, so I guess it's a really good question with regards to the Aspergillus, because you have your sort of classical Aspergillus symptoms, so respiratory signs, maybe loss and change of voice if it's affecting the tracheal, syringeal, bottom of the trachea area. But you get Aspergillus cases, particularly in birds that are breeding birds or birds that aren't being flown at that particular time, where you actually won't see respiratory symptoms. You got to remember, birds have such an efficient respiratory tract. It's like 10 times more efficient than the mammalian respiratory system, that they can have quite severe Aspergillus infection before they start showing respiratory signs, particularly if they're not being exerted. So if they're flying hard and you're like row crowing them every day, they'll start showing the respiratory signs sooner because they're being exerted and at high athletic performance. But if they are in the breeding season or in a molting or in a gap between flying, you may not actually see respiratory symptoms as your first symptoms of Aspergillus. So you'll see a bird that maybe might go off its food, change in fecal colour, will get green urates, might lose weight. Quite non-specific symptoms that could be any type of infection. I think this is sort of the take-home message for my clients when I discuss this, is the first sign that something's not right: change in appetite, change in the feces, change in the body condition. It's losing weight when you can't explain it, or you're having to feed it more food to keep it on a level weight. Get it investigated at that point, because that's the point where you've got a good chance for treatment success. If you wait until it's showing the respiratory signs or things have progressed further, waited even 48 hours, then your prognosis is not as good. So once we see those signs, and Aspergillus can affect all sorts of parts of the respiratory system and actually other parts of the body as well. But if it is in the trachea, for example, or down at the bottom of the trachea, it's blocking the airway quite quickly, the Aspergillus lesion. So they're going to get respiratory signs pretty quickly. If it's in the lung, where your gas exchange is happening, you're going to get a bird that shows respiratory symptoms pretty quickly, because if the lung's affected, they show breathing issues very soon in the disease process. But if the Aspergillus is in the air sacs, which is often the first place the Aspergillus starts, they often won't show a great deal of respiratory disease early on. And so that's where an early endoscopic examination, or we have a CT scanner, a CAT scanner, which allows us to look at the whole bird's respiratory system in really good detail without any invasive test. You can pick up Aspergillus at an early stage, and that's where your treatment successes are good. And we've got birds that we put endoscopes in, we biopsy the air sacs, take a bit of the lesion, and then you look at it under the microscope, you can see Aspergillus there. You get them treated early, and those birds actually have a really good treatment success. We've got much better medications for Aspergillus now than we did 10 years ago. We have the original Aspergillus treatments. They didn't kill Aspergillus, they just stopped it replicating. So your body's immune system still had to do a lot of the work. Whereas now the Aspergillus drugs we've got are what we call fungicidal, so they kill the fungus, not just stop it developing and growing any further. So we have much better success rates and lower toxicities with the treatment, because in the old days we'd cause as much toxicity with the treatment as sometimes you would actually fix the Aspergillus. But the drugs are definitely better. Techniques have improved. We can diagnose at an earlier stage with some of the new technology that we've got, using sort of human grade scanning systems. So the prognosis is better if you can diagnose it early, and we've had birds return to absolute full function after cases of Aspergillus.
Which drugs what's the like the generic brand name of the drugs that you prescribe most for those? So
we're using voriconazole, which is a later generation azole and antifungal drug. Traditionally, we used to use itraconazole, where we saw probably more toxicity and less treatment success and more resistance to treatment. So we're using a lot of voriconazole now, and voriconazole used to be branded by Pfizer under a VFend brand, and because it was the original drug, it was expensive, just like all drugs are. And then where patent ended. There's now generics, so the cost of treatment is certainly in the UK. I'm sure it'll be the same in the States, but the cost of treatment has dropped as well. So where you'd be talking like $1,000 for a course of treatment previously, you're talking 150.
Right.
So it becomes much more affordable as well.
What are your thoughts? I mean, I know there are some vets and some people that even kind of do, like, they'll get a new bird, and if they either, whether it's, obviously you're gonna keep a bird if you buy one captive bred or whatever, but I mean, as far as even wild birds, and they decide, okay, I'm gonna stick with this bird for the long haul or whatever. I know there's some people that'll even prophylactically, treat. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
We try and keep away from it unless we absolutely have to. So there are occasional circumstances I think it's medically justifiable to use prophylaxis. But if you talk about a global One Health thing, again, we talk about antibiotic resistance, superbugs. You can have exactly the same with fungal and fungal infections. So if you're exposing low levels of fungus, like non-disease levels, to antifungal drugs the whole time, they are going to develop resistance.
Gotcha.
And then when you have your real case, you're not going to be able to treat it, and that can happen fairly swiftly. So like if I gave you an example of when I might use a prophylactic, it might be, say, a young falcon breaks its leg, and I do surgery to fix that, and so it's going to have an anesthetic, it's going to be hospitalized in a strange environment for 2 or 3 days. It's going to have some stress. That's a bird that would benefit from Aspergillus prophylaxis. Or I had a client the other week give me a call because the neighboring farmer started combining upwind of where he was keeping his falcons, and the dust levels that was hitting the buildings was massive. The birds were stressed because of the noise. Their breathing was instantly changed because of the dust inhalation. Those falcons that were there would have had a much higher risk of developing Aspergillus. So we did use prophylaxis in those very specific cases. But if you're talking about like peregrines and non-Aspergillus sensitive species, or just normal birds at the start of training, that we won't be using prophylaxis, because it's not justifiable use. And to put it into context, at the moment in the UK, there's legislation. Sorry, not in the UK, in the EU, there's legislation at the moment being proposed that's going to hugely restrict veterinary access to antibiotic and antifungal drugs, to the point where some people on the extreme side of the argument want to ban antibiotics in animals.
Really?
So if we don't practice in a responsible way, we're going to lose access to these drugs in their entirety, which is going to have a huge effect on welfare. But they're looking from a One Health human point of view, where multiple resistant infections are killing, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people every year, worldwide. So they're obviously, compared to a few people's falcons versus the One Health, for a lot of people, they don't really see that withdrawing the drugs as an issue. So that's why we're so careful. And this is why when you ring up your doctor, your veterinary doctor, and say, I can have some antibiotics for this problem, they're going to say, no, bring your bird in, we need to examine it, we need to make sure it actually needs these drugs before we prescribe them. Same with the antifungals.
I've had a vet go ahead and just prescribe me some antibiotics. I mean, I told him I wouldn't use them unless I absolutely needed them, but just in case, I've had incidents with, feral cats sometimes, and, Harris hawks. And of course, if you don't get antibiotics on board, sometimes, you obviously know way more about this than I do, but that nasty strand of bacteria that's carried in, the mouths of cats and stuff can kill a bird within 24 hours sometimes if it's not treated. And there's things like that. But I mean, that's very interesting. And I'm glad that I asked you that, because I've always been kind of curious. I mean, I figured any kind of microorganism over time with evolution can build up any kind of resistance to, I mean, they're just like any other type of living thing, right? Yeah. So it's very interesting stuff. But before we wrap things up, I do want to continue the trend though of getting a favorite story of yours, or a favorite memory of a particular bird, or an experience that you've had, or just anything like that in general that is kind of always sticks. There's always a good story, either with a bird or a hunting experience or something that a falconer has. So
I'm going to give two clinical cases I dealt with, but they were falconry birds. So they were both fractures, both wing fractures. One was a little tiercel peregrine, and it was an absolute favorite bird of this, not just the falconer, but the whole falconers family. It was like the bird they all liked to watch fly. They really liked it, and it was stooping in on a moorland area, and it sort of stooped into the heather, but within the heather there was a big rock, and it hit this rock with its wing and had the most awful break at the bottom of its humerus, and also the bottom of its radius and ulna, so around the elbow. It had fractures either side of the elbow, huge fractures. And we have a general rule: if the fracture is too close to the joint, when you try and repair it, the callus, the healing bone, will then interfere with the joint, and the risk of that bird never returning to function is really high. So we sort of took the x-rays, and we sat back and we had a really honest discussion and said, and I said very honestly, I don't think this bird's going to fly properly again. I think the injury is too severe. It's got 3 bones that are broken either side of the elbow joint. It's not going to do well. I don't think it's going to fly as a proper falconry bird again. At best, I might be able to repair it to the point it could maybe go into a breeding project. You like the bird, you've flown it for many seasons, you like its genetics and its bloodline. It may be able to be a bird that you could use for breeding. So he said, no, I want to give it every chance, do what you can. So we fixed the bird and did the surgery, and sort of 3 or 4 weeks later, did our post-operative check, and he drove this bird 9 hours. This bird came 9 hours overnight from the moors where they were flying in Scotland down to us overnight, and so we treated it, and came back 3 or 4 weeks later, took some x-rays, and I was like, oh, that doesn't actually look too bad. Fine, it might do a little bit better than I thought. And then I didn't hear from the client for about 6 months, and 6 months later he sent me this picture of it flying back up in Scotland. Couldn't really tell that it ever had the injury, and I was like, wow. And it's not so much what we did, but just birds' ability to heal was incredible. Like it was to the point where you might have even been thinking about amputating the wing. It was that severe. And this bird's now had flown 3 more seasons and is back to normal. So I think that's wonderful. It's just the picture, and it was that personal story. It was the family's favorite bird, and to get that bird back flying is wonderful. And then there's a bird that flies at Vowley as well, and I'm sure they won't mind me saying, because they announced it on the channel yesterday, but there was a bird that a couple of seasons ago, again, another wing fracture, really severe. It was a humeral fracture. It was a nasty fracture, and did surgery, and that bird's back as one of the best birds at Vowley now, and one of the best birds in the hunt race, and flying fantastically well. So every time I see that bird fly, and I think it'll probably fly today, I look at that bird in the air and just think that's fantastic. It's just great you can get some of these birds back doing what they do well. So I get more joy out of that, getting clients' birds back flying than probably any of my falconry stories. But that's where I get my real kicks.
No,
from seeing that.
That's great. We don't often get that other perspective. It's always a person's bird or whatever. So I mean, that's cool that you offered those things up as that sort of perspective, because we don't get to talk to vets and things like that much. But no, that's great, man. Well, I mean, as far as everything else goes, I mean, is there anything, other thoughts that you want to finish with? I mean, any maybe a pearl of wisdom, a little bit of advice that you want to pass on to people, or any other thoughts that you might have?
Yeah, I think the main thing with falconry is that, for me, I get involved with a lot of the legislation side of things. I'm always asked to read this new legislation that they're trying to bring in Holland, or read this new legislation they're trying to bring in the UK, which potentially will restrict falconry further. And I'm obviously fighting on the falconer side in these situations. But I think as falconers, we are responsible to drive best practice in everything that we do. And the better that we practice as falconers, the easier it is to continue to do what we do, and try and work together, and from a conservation point of view, and look at the real global picture of falconry, because it's a minority. It's very much a minority activity. You've got, what did we say, 4,000 falconers in the US?
Yeah, I think there's somewhere around that, like, licensed, but only really like 1,000-ish or so. I don't know the recent numbers, so sorry if I'm misquoting those.
No.
But that's kind of the last realm that I've heard. Yeah,
Absolutely. And I've heard anything from sort of 10 to 20,000 in the UK, because not everyone's licensed or don't have licensed species. It's hard to track in the UK. You don't need a license. There's no track of everyone who owns Harris hawks, for example. Whereas peregrines, because they're a licensed species, we know how many peregrines there are in the UK, but it's difficult for certain species. But it's a minority activity. We're under a lot of pressure from all sorts of organisations to ban it in across the globe, and I think we need to work together for animal welfare, best practice, evolve to ensure that falconry is here for the next generation, because we're all a bit concerned that we could be the last generation of falconers, certainly in the UK. So that's the big thing for me. That's what I'm trying to work towards, and making sure we're doing right by our birds, and that there's absolutely nothing we can be attacked on, because we're doing everything as well as we possibly can.
Perfect. Well, if anyone that's listening that's not aware of you or your practice, I mean, is there anything you'd like to plug real quick about your practice, or any way people can get a hold of you if they need your services?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're Great Western Exotics. We're in sort of central western United Kingdom. We've got a website, Facebook. You can look us up there. More than happy. We've got email address on our website, Great Western Exotics. So if you Google that, you'll find us pretty quickly. We're always interested to hear from people and advise and help out wherever we can. We do some courses in the UK for falconers on first aid and emergency care, sort of what you can do between an injury or an accident happening and getting the bird to the vet to improve survival. So particularly for newer falconers, that's something to look out for, something that we offer. So that's something that's worth booking onto.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks so much for your time. And like I said, I'm glad we could fit this in this weekend. And it's been nice getting to know you a little bit and talking and stuff. And man, I hope it's a good rest of the show for you. And it looks like the sun's finally coming out just a little bit here. So at least that's a good thing.
Exactly. A bit of blue sky. No, it's been a pleasure.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you again so much. And let's go hang out.
Perfect.